Hello, everyone. My name is Tom Smith, and I'm a professor in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology and Institute of the Environment and Sustainability at UCLA. And I'm delighted to be here today at the invitation of World War Zero to discuss the impacts of climate change on biodiversity. Joining me today are two outstanding evolutionary biologists, Doctors Kristen Ruegg and Racheal Bay. And I'll let them briefly introduce themselves. So why don't we start with you, Kristen?
Hi, yeah, my name's Kristen Ruegg, and I'm an assistant professor at Colorado State University. And I study migratory bird conservation and evolution.
Great. And Racheal?
Hi, everyone. My name is Racheal Bay, and I'm an assistant professor at University of California, Davis in the Department of Evolution and Ecology. I study how humans are changing the environment and how wild populations of plants and animals might adapt to those changes.
Okay, great. Well, before we get started, I'd like to make a few introductory remarks to kind of cue up our discussion today. Of course, we're going to be talking about biodiversity, biological diversity, which is, we can think of it as an umbrella term for the degree of nature's variety. So it encompasses all species of plants and animals and microorganisms, the genes they contain, and the ecosystems and ecological processes of which they are part of, as are we. Biodiversity provides all the essential ecological services that humans depend on, from pollinators and genetic diversity that support food supply and stable ecosystems that keep us safe from pandemics. Biodiversity is also a source of over half of the pharmaceuticals in the world. So, treatments for cancer and heart disease and COVID-19, many of those, over 50% of those pharmaceuticals are derived from plants and animals. Over the last century, the main drivers of species populations declines and extinctions are due to a variety of issues, such as overharvesting, habitat loss, and pollution. And today, almost every week now, we're bombarded with new studies showing how biodiversity is declining in the world. A recent study of over 4,000 mammals that came out earlier this month showed that of those 4,000 mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, those populations have declined by 68% since 1970. Another focusing on birds has shown that populations of birds just here in North America have declined by nearly 3 billion individuals in the past 50 years. So climate change in all of this is, you can think of it as kind of a force multiplier when it comes to threats to biodiversity. And now it turns out climate change is not just on the horizon, it is here. And it's a major driving force in the loss of biodiversity. Under climate change, plants and animals have to move or adapt, or they will have to go extinct. And so there aren't very many options for species. And so right now we're seeing major range shifts in species as they move to higher latitudes and up in elevation to escape growing temperatures. And not to mention the sort of the blunt force trauma driven by climate change, such as raging forest fires, extreme heat events, and massive hurricanes that we're seeing, all phenomenon driven by a changing climate. In fact, just 2 days ago, there was a new study that came out of Australia and published in the Journal of the Royal Society that shows that the Great Barrier Reef, the largest reef system in the world, stretching over 1,500 miles, half of it has died. And so clearly we're in a biodiversity crisis. It's analogous to, I think of it as sort of analogous to a patient in the ER going under cardiac arrest. We are now living in a biodiversity era, and it's really, this is a moment for code red for biodiversity. It's that serious. There was a report earlier this month released by the United Nations entitled The Global Biodiversity Outlook. And basically what they concluded in that report was that humanity is at the crossroads. And if we fail to meet our targets, we are really at the precipice. And so far we have not been meeting those targets. And so we are really under threat. Well, what I'd like to do today is focus our discussion on really two questions. And I think we have an opportunity to probe this issue a little bit deeper than in some cases, because all three of us are evolutionary biologists and we can think about things slightly different than other just conservation biologists, although we're also conservation biologists. But there are two questions I'd like us to focus on. The first is the threats to biodiversity from climate change and how they can be better understood. So how can we study them to really understand how they function, how these threats act in the ecosystem? And second, how can science help us get out of this mess and find ways to mitigate the effects of climate change on biodiversity? So those are our sort of two broad goals, and we're going to see where the conversation goes today. But I'd like to start with Kristen. You know, the last several months, we've seen massive wildfires in the West, and the data suggests that these have been caused by a warming climate. We've now lost, I think, more than 4 million acres of forests in the West. And apart from the human tragedy, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the impacts of biodiversity and how science can help us understand what's going on with these fires and what their impacts are on biodiversity.
Yeah, so talk about a vivid demonstration of climate change in action. Everything from ash falling from the sky regularly in my own backyard to reports of, millions of acres being burned. It's pretty shocking. And, all of this is, going to have an impact beyond just, humans. When we talk about 4 million acres lost, that's critical habitat for a lot of species that are already being stressed by a number of different things, from the human development side to other impacts of climate change, like surviving the really high temperatures during peak summer months. But one of the most really vivid demonstrations that as a conservation biologist, evolutionary biologist that focuses on migratory birds, that we noticed is these massive die-offs of migratory birds at a scale that nobody really had seen before. So, I wasn't there personally, but just reading the reports in the newspaper of, researchers out in the field seeing, hundreds of birds just lying dead side by side. It's just, from in the diversity of species that were impacted by this is really impressive. Some, aerial feeders, as well as warblers and sparrows. And we're not really sure why, but a lot of us are scrambling to try to figure out what might have gone on and how these fires may have contributed. Because of course the fires occurred right during the peak migration for a lot of these species as they're leaving their breeding grounds in the north and heading down to wintering areas in Central America. So yeah, it's been pretty crazy.
So just picking up on that, what do birds have to do to prepare for migration? Physiologically, they're really at a knife's edge there before they migrate. What do they have to do to get ready to move?
Yeah. So one of the critical things, of course, is putting on a lot of fat. And because fat is a bird's fuel, and without fat, they're not going to successfully make the migratory journey. Migration without massive fires and without any, major other anthropogenic disturbances is already a really stressful event in a bird's life, and they really need to have access to a lot of resources to be able, at key points along their migratory journey, to be able to successfully make it to their wintering areas.
So it's not just that they need to be, put on fat before they leave. They also have to have places where they can stop along the way and refuel.
Right. So that's one of the ideas about what might have gone on, either, key stopover locations along their migratory journey were wiped out by the fires. And so they didn't have access to the resources that were there. Or it's possible that it's something having to do with the smoke and that having a physiological effect. I mean, all of us that live in places like Colorado and California, like we do, know that we've been staying inside because it's actually dangerous to be outside. And, one can imagine it would be the same thing for birds who, need to, have clean air in order to be able to stay healthy as well.
So I know one of the things that people were wondering when this big die-off happened in New Mexico is they were wondering where these birds were coming from. Are they just coming in randomly from different places in the US? Or are they coming in from specific areas? So how might this event be specifically tied to the fires, and how might one study it?
Yeah, so, well, that's a great question, Tom. So, one of the things I forgot to say in the introduction is that in addition to being a professor at Colorado State University, I co-direct a project with you called the Bird Gene Escape Project, where we've been developing genetic tools to track migratory movements of birds, across space for the last 10 years or so. And so we've been doing this largely so that we can develop a baseline of how birds are moving across space. And then as these fires came about, and one of the things people were wondering is, have the fires caused the birds to be off course, off their traditional migratory trajectory? Are they going big lengths to avoid the fires? And how might this be impacting their physiology and ability to survive? And so one of the ways that we can use our genetic tools is to, now that we have a baseline already for many of these species that were impacted by the fires, we can go back and try and look at which populations were coming through New Mexico and whether our genetic information suggests they were significantly off course or not. So we'd love to work with folks to make that happen.
Right. Can those genetic tools, that toolbox, also be used to understand renewable energy and some of the threats? I mean, obviously, to move out of climate change, we've got to increase renewables, solar and wind, and yet there's also this countervailing issue that, they kill birds. And so, is there a way that we can use some of the science you're doing to understand that phenomenon?
Yeah, so in addition to just getting a general map of where birds are breeding, wintering, and migrating across the year, which helps with developing conservation strategies for birds, as well as providing a baseline understanding of how birds are moving across space, just so that when things like this come up, we know what that baseline is. We can also use those same sort of genetic tools to identify birds that have been subject to collisions. So that's one of the ways we've been working with wind and solar industry, is to try and understand the population level impacts and help mitigate any potential impacts with wind turbines or solar installations. And, it's really been a nice partnership because, we all want to limit the impact of climate change. And so by working together to solve some of these potential impacts and come up with ways to mitigate them, we're going to get to a solution much more quickly. But one of the other ways we can use this data from a whole different perspective, which is more Racheal's category probably, is trying to use the genomic information to understand how birds are locally adapted across space to climate, and then what that means for their future under climate change.
That's a great segue. So to Racheal's work. Racheal, you recently published an important paper in the journal Science on how one can leverage evolutionary biology to help mitigate climate change impacts. Can you kind of take us through the study? I know it's a complex one, but I think the audience would love to hear about it.
Yeah, sure. So as I said in my introduction, I'm really interested in how different wild populations might be able to adapt to all of the pressures that are applied by human impacts and especially climate change. And particularly, we've been interested in formulating predictions. So which populations and which species might be able to adapt and which might be more susceptible. And we are evolutionary biologists, and specifically we are genomic biologists. So we were interested to see whether we could use genome sequences to aid in those kinds of predictions. So for the study you're talking about, we used as a case study the yellow warbler. So this little bird you can see behind me. And they're a really interesting case for this kind of study because during the breeding season, so during the summer, they live broadly across North America. That means we have yellow warblers here in the Central Valley where we have really, really hot, dry summers, often characterized by drought recently. And there's also yellow warblers in the Pacific Northwest where it's a bit wetter. And we also have yellow warblers on the East Coast where it's even wetter than that, at least during the summer. So our sort of premise is that not all of these birds are the same. Some might be better able to withstand the environmental conditions that are characterized by drought. Some might be better suited to those wetter habitats. And those differences might be encoded in their DNA. So we sequenced genomes for a bunch of yellow warblers from across North America, and we looked for differences in their genomes that are associated with the different climate parameters. So precipitation regimes, temperature regimes, things like that. And we actually found certain genomic regions that we thought did look different between populations in these different climate regions. So the idea is that your DNA is specifically matched to the climate that you live in. This is what Kristen was talking about when she mentioned local adaptation. So birds that live in dry climates, their DNA is best for dry climates. Birds that live in wet climates, their DNA is best for wet climates. So with that information, we can use that to project what might happen into the future. So if you're a bird whose DNA is suited to a wet climate and you see drying, maybe that offset will be bad for you in the future. So we actually used climate projections to try to see how much birds' genomes were going to mismatch future climate. And we found a lot of regions that seemed to be okay. We wouldn't need to see a lot of adaptation in the future. So particularly the center of the country, the sort of Midwest, looked like it didn't need a lot of adaptation in the future. But areas of the Rocky Mountains, as well as some of the coastal regions, seem like they might be more vulnerable to future climate change. And in our study, we specifically found that drying was the factor that seemed most important there. Birds.
I was going to say, what most surprised you about your results?
Yeah, so that was sort of, we generated this map of vulnerability, and we were wondering about how we might be able to test that map. We can't jump 50 years into the future and ask which populations have declined. But luckily, we have a lot of information on bird populations over the past 50 years. So because people like to look at birds a lot, because people like to count birds a lot, we have some sort of standardized data of how many birds are around at any given time. So we were able to compare our assessment of vulnerability with those population trends. And we found that the populations that we found were most vulnerable had already been decreasing over the past 50 years. So this is telling us maybe there's already some effects of climate change, and maybe those effects are already causing this offset between the bird's DNA and the climate it's existing in.
Yeah, so maybe we should turn to Kristen now and kind of expand on this idea of adaptation and genomes, and talk a little bit about how we can use approaches that Racheal just described to manage threatened species.
Yeah, so often, as is the case, we develop new methodologies based on species that might not be of the highest conservation concern. And so Racheal sort of forged the way with her science paper, just introducing a new way of trying to understand how not just birds, but any species that you would want to apply these methods to may be able to adapt to future climate change or not. And so what we then did is try to apply it to a species that where there are already extreme threats. So the willow flycatcher is a broadly distributed migratory bird species, but the southwestern form of this species has been on the endangered species list for quite some time. And so we applied this methodology to try and understand how climate change may be affecting the willow flycatcher in general, but in particular the southwestern willow flycatcher, and how that might inform conservation under the Endangered Species Act. And what was interesting is that unlike the yellow warbler that Racheal described, the willow flycatcher seemed to be tied, its genes seem to be linked to persistence, to temperature differences across the range. And we found particular genes linked to thermal tolerance. And this makes sense in light of what we know about the intensity of summer heat waves, particularly in the South, where drought is it's being most severely influenced by drought more than anywhere. And this is where the southwestern endangered willow flycatcher exists. So this really helped us kind of not just understand which populations were most vulnerable, but also sort of at a mechanistic level of why those populations may be having trouble persisting amidst the climate change that we're already seeing.
So this is kind of for both of you working on these species, but I'm wondering, so how can we leverage this information? Obviously, we've only done 2 species, so more species will have to be analyzed. And then what are the possibilities for mitigating climate change? I mean, given the fact that we're not going to be able to reduce climate as much as we would like to, warming as much as we'd like to, what sort of management tools could grow out of this? Do you take a shot at that?
Yeah, I can take a shot at that. So one of the ways that I see this kind of information really informing management strategies is prioritization of protected areas. So of course, these species rely on very specific habitats. And we really want to sort of mediate the synergistic stressors that go along with habitat loss plus climate change. So you might imagine a scenario where, for the southwest willow flycatcher, for example, you might start to protect habitat in the areas you think might be most vulnerable to climate change. You might then scale that up to multiple species where you have these sort of vulnerability hotspots, and you might protect that habitat so that populations that are going to be most impacted by climate change aren't also losing their habitats.
So in other words, you can, maybe Kristen, you could talk about how do you become proactive, try to identify areas that, you know, because we can model into the future and then maybe get agencies to protect those areas now because that's what the birds are going to need then in the future, or?
Yeah, I mean, one of the models that we both learned from you, Tom, is that we should start by having sort of buy-in early and work with partners from the ground up. So, you know, with all of the species that we work on in the Bird Genoscape project, we do so in collaboration with often hundreds of different individuals. And then by doing things in partnership, the information can get translated through those 100 partners and through the, you know, their different partnerships. And so, and, you know, we do things like this where we try to communicate the results of our science as much as possible. So I think that, you know, as scientists, our role is to provide the information. But when we partner with folks that are more involved in policy and in government and can actually change the laws and enforce the protections, that's where we can really affect change.
Yeah. Can you talk about some of the agencies you've worked with or you work with currently? I mean, you can't name them all because there are too many.
I know. Let's see.
Maybe you could talk about some of the big ones.
Yeah, so, you know, we work with scientists in the US Fish and Wildlife Service, for sure, the US Geological Survey. We work with a lot of different nonprofits as well, like the National Audubon Society, the Institute for Bird Populations. I'm sure I'm forgetting some. Racheal, can you think of any? I mean, we work with a lot of different partners. The Biodiversity Institute, yeah.
Local nonprofits too, as well as a bunch
of Can you also speak about the relationships that these projects have created for our partners in other countries?
Yeah, so I mean, that's another huge part when you're, and I feel like I should throw this question to you, Tom. You're right. I mean, I guess I can say a little bit, but then it would be fun to, because you've taken a lot of these methodologies and are applying them to try and understand conservation in Africa. You know, for us, in the Western Hemisphere, we're focusing not just on North America and conservation organizations here, but on building partnerships with Latin American scientists, because of course, migratory birds are only on their breeding grounds for 3 to 4 months a year. And so if we really want to affect change, we have to partner across all of the places where they're spending time. So, you know, yeah, so we work actively with scientists in academic and government agencies across the Western Hemisphere. But how about you want to tell us about applying this to conservation in Africa?
Well, it's hard to get me to talk about Africa, but I guess if you twist my arm, I will. Yeah, Africa is sort of ground zero for climate change, and it's a place where I've been working for 30 years. And much of this work that Kristen and Racheal have been talking about has sort of been fodder for thinking about how can we translate that to Africa that's in such a dire state in terms of where it's going to end up in the face of climate change. If you look at Africa as a whole, estimates suggest that it's going to lose 40% of its plants and animals if the global mean temperature rises to 3 degrees C, which is, you know, 3 degrees C over pre-industrial levels, which is almost a certainty. And so the question becomes, you know, what do we do about it? How can we maximize the amount of biodiversity that we can preserve? And, you know, Africa as a continent, 1 out of every 5 species on the planet occurs there. It's also really important for carbon. About 30% of the world's terrestrial peak carbon is located, most of it in one country, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, right in the dead center, in those massive peat bogs. And so what we did almost a half a dozen years ago is we started to develop a project focused around how can we get ahead of the curve and figure out what areas to protect under climate change to maximize the number of species and populations that we could preserve. And so this was a project that was actually funded by the National Science Foundation. Over the course of 5 years, there were 40 scientists working on 4 continents, 25 universities, policymakers, decision makers. And the goal of it was to basically identify priority areas now under current climate change and then project them into the future. In other words, where do we want to put protected areas in, say, 2080, when we know the climate's going to be very different? And so the tack we took is sort of leveraging the work on the migratory bird work that you guys have been doing, is to basically look at the amount of genomic variation, the amount of adaptive variation in these populations. And we looked at 9 species, everything from plants to chimpanzees. And we tried to identify where genomic adaptive variation would be maximized under a future climate, and then work with decision makers to try to create new protected areas for those areas. Because it turns out that if you look at Africa, some of the coastal areas in Cameroon, for example, we looked at, I mean, it's not likely that any of the 9 species that we studied are going to be able to exist in large portions of central Cameroon during under a future climate scenario. But there's some areas to the north of those areas that might be good. And one of the things we tried to stress in our studies is to try to identify areas of high adaptive variation, because those are the building blocks that natural selection works with in order to adjust to change. And so we've tried to identify those areas. It's sort of by doing that, you sort of take a bet hedging approach. You don't know exactly which individuals are going to do better, but at least you, by preserving as much variation as you can, the hope is that some will make it. So anyway, I don't want to go on and on about this, but although I could, anyway, you can read more about it in World War Zero's Frontline magazine, and about our work in the Congo Basin. And there's also a wonderful article there by Enrique Sala on his new book, A Nature of Nature, and he has a nice video talking about biodiversity and climate change. So I draw your attention to that. Well, we've been talking about animals that fly, and it would be, I think, now is maybe a good time to turn to animals in the ocean and what's going on in the ocean. And we're lucky that Racheal is also a marine biologist who studies coral. And I mentioned, at the outset, this tragedy we're seeing in the Great Barrier Reef of Australia, and how coral is dying. And there are a lot of people that are saying, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Racheal, that we may not have any coral by the end of the century. And so I know you've been working on some of the things that we might be able to do about that. So we'd love to hear from you about coral and climate change and where we might go.
Yeah, sure. So coral reefs over the past few years have been kind of the poster child for the negative effects of climate change. It seems like every year now we have news of massive coral bleaching and mortality events. And as you said, we just saw a paper come out that said we've lost half of the Great Barrier Reef since 1990, so just over the past 30 years. Usually coral mortality is preceded by coral bleaching, which are those pictures of like stark white corals you might see in the news. And basically that means that they've lost this little algae that lives in their cells that provides them food. So functionally, when you have coral mortality after bleaching, it's because the coral starves to death. But like the bird projects that we do, not all corals are the same. So some species seem to survive these heat waves better than other species, and some individuals seem to survive the heat waves better than other individuals. And just sort of bringing that back to the interests of my research and my lab, we're really interested in explaining these differences in tolerance between species and between individuals, and then using those to predict something about what the community or the ecosystem might look like into the future. Just to backtrack a little bit, coral reef ecosystems are incredibly important to especially island communities. They provide a huge amount of protein for island communities, as well as coastal protection against storms, which we're seeing more and more often. So they are really a vital ecosystem, both to the human and natural communities. We were interested in looking at differences in thermal tolerance across individuals, and again, trying to figure out which genes were responsible for those. So in a natural bleaching event, you can go and swim out over a coral reef and you'll see some individuals that are bleaching or dead and some individuals that look totally fine. So we're interested in what causes those differences. And we were able to use sort of genetic differences between individuals that are tolerant and individuals that aren't to create a predictive model. So very similar to what we did in birds. And we used the IPCC projections for ocean temperature.
What are those again?
Yeah, so the IPCC projections tell us what kind of climate we might expect in the future. And they give us different scenarios, and they range from a mitigated climate scenario. So maybe we mitigate our emissions and we actually see a decrease in ocean temperatures over the next century, to what we're calling now business as usual, which is a severe climate change scenario. So we looked at what might happen to a particular coral reef, one that we were studying in the Cook Islands, under these different scenarios. And based on our genetic information and whether we thought corals might adapt to that, we saw that under the business as usual scenario, we would see extinction of that population before the end of the century. But based on a mitigated emission scenario, we actually saw a rescue of that population. So the slower rate of climate change allowed the corals the room to sort of adapt to what was coming at them.
So in this case, if we could reduce CO2, reduce other greenhouse gases, there's a chance that there's enough variation in the coral communities that they could rebound. Is that fair to say?
Exactly. So corals have a lot of genetic variation, and that can be really useful for adaptation. And the key component is how fast is the climate changing and how fast can they adapt?
Yeah. What is the temperature difference between, a temperature where there's going to be a healthy coral and the temperature that the coral is going to be under stress and die? How big is that difference?
It's surprisingly small. So most corals now live within 1 to 2 degrees Celsius of their upper thermal limit. So it actually doesn't take a lot of warming to see bleaching and mortality in coral reef.
Is there, I know you have more to say about that. One thing that came to mind is, in the Alps, for example, they're actually putting tarps over snowfields to reduce the glaciers melting and so forth. And I seem to recall something about this in this article in the paper about the Great Barrier Reef. Are there actually kind of mitigation approaches that you can use on coral to cool them down, while we try to fix the climate?
So there are a lot of really creative solutions that people have been trying out to mitigate our really acute need to save corals. One of them is really similar to the tarps over the snow. People have been experimenting with putting shade cloth over coral because there is a synergistic effect with sunlight and heat. So corals that are not as stressed by the light might be able to handle the heat better. There are people that have been experimenting with actually pumping cooler water onto reefs during heat waves in order to just lower the temperature very locally. And so both of those are really, really very local solutions and can only work on a very small scale. There are, we talked a bit about designing protected areas based on climate susceptibility. People have been talking about doing that in corals too. And then there are even sort of maybe more creative solutions or maybe more risky solutions like selective breeding in corals for particular traits like thermal tolerance or even biobanking. So preserving sperm and eggs from corals in the hopes that we'll be able to use that in the future.
I know in some places, especially foresters are using translocations. In other words, they're moving trees that are adapted to warmer temperatures and actually taking the seeds and planting them in northern areas. Could we do the same thing with corals?
Yeah, so there's a lot of effort going into designing sort of climate-ready transplant projects. And actually, in the paper that I talked about earlier, we used our model to see how effective those strategies might be. And what we found was that if you brought sort of equatorial corals, so the corals that lived in the warmest part of the world, and brought them to what are now cooler waters in hopes that those populations will adapt to the future, you could increase the tolerance of that population, but it would take an enormous number of individuals. So yes, I can see that working on on sort of a local scale where you want to preserve a particular reef, but corals are slow growing and they're really hard to sort of be happy. So on a global scale, that doesn't really seem to me like it's going to protect reefs all over the world.
Yeah, well, in the case of the Great Barrier Reef, I mean, it's 1,500 miles long. I mean, how could you design something? You mentioned it already, but I think it would be good for the listener to know just what the impacts on humans would be without coral reefs. Could you speak a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so maybe I'll start with a story. Some of my work was on an island called Manahiki in the Northern Cook Islands, and that island has about 1.5 square feet of land. And the people living on that island could bring me down to the shore and say, this is where the ocean used to be. And so they're seeing sea level rise. They see it within their lifetime, but more than that, they see increases in storms. And so they'll tell stories about clinging to palm trees when cyclones come through.
Wow.
And how many of their relatives have moved off that island in order to not have to worry about those storms anymore. So we're seeing more and more climate refugees from these islands. So, people in island communities in the Pacific and in the Caribbean really rely on coral reefs, not only for their food, they also provide tourist dollars to a lot of places, but also coastal protection. So the impact of losing those reefs on a community can be enormous. And as just sort of a point of interest, there's some discussion about putting up seawalls to protect against to serve as coastal protection for communities that are losing coral reefs. But one of the really cool things about corals is that they're naturally growing. So as sea level rises, corals, if given the opportunity, can sort of keep up with that sea level rise, where an artificial sea level will not. They can't do that in sort of an unlimited rate, but they could potentially continue to protect those communities.
Yeah, well, clearly there's much more we need to know about coral and how to mitigate these things. It seems like that right now we're just in the concept stage of figuring out what to do and of trying to use the best science to inform that. But in terms of any kind of real mitigation, we're not there yet.
Yeah, I think that's true. We are really in the concept stage, and I've been really impressed with the creativity that's been brought by the community. But unfortunately, we're in an emergency now, so it's not
Yeah,
really the best time to be at the concept stage of the project.
yeah. So it's the code red for coral reefs, I guess. Yeah. Great. Well, this has been a really stimulating discussion. I think I'd like to kind of open it up a little bit and have you guys talk about um, looking down the road. We'll start with Kristen. So, looking down the road in your research, what you're as I said, we're all bombarded with these facts and what's going on. But what really keeps you up at night?
I think what keeps me up at night is probably what keeps a lot of people up at night, which is what kind of legacy are we leaving our kids?
You
I
have a
have,
daughter, right? So
right. So I have a daughter, and I see that in my lifetime, the frequency of these extreme events, extreme weather events, wildfires, massive die-offs, it's just happening with increasing frequency. And I understand that this is all it's all linked, it's all due to climate change. But how can we convince others that these short-term emergencies are all part of one larger problem? Um, yeah, so that, I guess that's what worries me most.
yeah, yeah. What gives you hope?
I think like a lot of the work that I do, building networks and collaborations and working with students gives me hope. There's a lot of passion out there, and for people who have, grasped this connectivity between all of these extreme events and the role that climate change is playing. There's a lot of motivation to affect change, and especially talking to students and younger people, you know attitudes have really shifted, and if we can harness that energy, I really do believe in the power of human capacity to affect change when we make the decision to do so. So yeah.
Great. How about you, Rachel? What are you looking down the road? You're looking at both terrestrial and marine systems. What keeps you up at night?
Yeah, so I mean, we've kind of alluded to this, and I think, we tend to get caught up in how science can inform mitigation strategies for climate change. But the thing that keeps me up at night is that ultimately the only way to stop all of these negative effects is to lower emissions. And none of the science that I'm doing is lowering emissions. It's just trying to keep populations around long enough for us globally to decide and prioritize that lowering emissions is the thing that we want to do. So while I enjoy doing climate change work and I think it's really important, I think ultimately as a global community, we need to decide to end climate change.
And what gives you hope?
Um, well, so from the biodiversity perspective, we see incredible resilience built into populations and ecosystems. And that's exactly what we study. We study differences between species, differences between individuals in how susceptible and how resilient they are. And we study the diversity of species and individuals out there. And I think those ecosystems are resilient if we could just get out of their way. Evolution or adaptation is a powerful but not but limited force. So I think ecosystems are resilient, but sort of along the same lines as Kristen was speaking to, from a human perspective, we're all really lucky to be educators, and we see the kinds of skills and dedication that exists in the people that are about to enter the workforce. And my students are just incredibly creative and passionate and want to make a big change in the world. And I'm inspired by them every single day. So I think they'll continue to do innovative science. I think they'll continue to try to make a difference in the world and hopefully find solutions to climate change.
Well, that was great. you give us all great inspiration, both of you, for the work you're doing and the opportunities that your research can provide to find solutions. And so I think it's we have to find the political will to reduce greenhouse gases, and I think that's where we are. I'll just say parenthetically, I gave my first lecture on climate change as a freshly minted, new professor back in the early 90s. And at the time, the amount of carbon in the atmosphere was 350 parts per million. Now it's over 412. And, at the time I wrote that first lecture, I thought, gosh, this is so important. Everyone's going to want to find solutions. And yet we just haven't made much progress. And I think there was another issue back in those days. It was called the ozone hole. And we were able to solve that problem as a global community. But this one has been a lot tougher. And so anyway, I still have hope, and my hope comes from people like you two who are, on the front lines making a difference. So anyway, thank you again for participating in this podcast, webcast, or whatever we're calling it, and we look forward to staying in touch. But thanks again, and thank you also to World War Zero for inviting us to chat with everyone today.
Thanks, Tom.
Thanks.